All right, thank you, Jenny. Thank you all for being with us this afternoon. Great to have you here virtually. This is the continuing program on the Workman and Temple family history. We started with bringing them to Mexican California in the late 1820s and up to the 1840s. We've gone through every decade since then, and we're now into the 1880s. So the title is because we have different branches of the family that are experiencing different levels of fortune in Los Angeles during that time period. So if you were with us last time, there was a boom that was fairly small compared to later ones in terms of the growth of the population and the development of the economy. That was end of the Civil War period into the middle 1870s. The Workman and Temple families were very involved and prominent in many activities during that boom, including having their own bank. So the photograph here on the left is looking to the east, and the Temple block is where I'm highlighting here on the right side of the photograph. That's now where Los Angeles City Hall is today. So Spring Street in the foreground, Main Street where the streetcar is, Temple Street going up the hill to the west here. Unfortunately, as the state economy cratered in the summer of 1875, the Bank of Temple and Workman was in financial distress. They didn't have enough cash in reserve, having invested a lot of money from depositors and their own personal funds in a wide variety of projects, oil, real estate, etc. And so in 1876, the bank failed. And then the families experienced a loss of most of their property, having taken out a loan to try to save their bank from a guy named Lucky Baldwin. Baldwin foreclosed on his loan in 1879 and took virtually all of the property that the Workman and Temple families had because that was put down as security for the loan. The failure of the bank was probably the most dramatic example of what happened in Los Angeles towards the end of the 1870s. The economy remained in the doldrums for several years. There was also a national depression in the 1870s too, so it was happening throughout much of America. And into the early 1880s, things still really hadn't recovered. And that was going to happen a bit later in the decade, but in the early part of the 80s, things were still a little bit iffy on the economic front. The photograph on the right here is taken from the Temple block. So let me go back to the photo here on the left. This northern edge of the building, looking off to the left, is the view you see here in the photograph on the right. You can kind of tell by looking at some of the buildings, the structure, the Downey block, built by ex-Governor John Downey, is this one. Across the street, you can see this structure with the Italianate arched windows, and a few of those are here. The corner building at Commercial Street in Maine, you can see a little bit of that off here to the right. But setting the scene for you in the early part of the 1880s when things are still in recovery mode economically. Now, of the two banking partners, William Workman unfortunately committed suicide about 5 months after his bank failed in 1876. His son-in-law and partner, F.P.F. Temple, who ironically was elected Los Angeles County Treasurer just as the bank was having difficulties, did serve out his 2-year term until 1878, but he had a series of strokes, likely due to the stress of what had happened. He is shown here, F.P.F. Temple, with his wife, Antonia Margarita Workman, and he died, FPF did, in April 1880 of another stroke, leaving his widow and large family with a lot of uncertainty, personally, of course, as well as financially. So Mrs. Temple had a lot to grapple with during the 1880s, not the least of which was what to do with her large brood of children. The oldest in 1880, Thomas, here to her right, was in his mid-20s. The youngest was 8 years old, so she had minor children and there had to be guardianship for them, but she also had her older children to deal with. Fortunately, in some ways, she did have her own property. It's worth pointing out that women could have property in California at a time when in much of the United States that wasn't permissible. The husband had total control of household property, but because California had a pre-existing situation under Spain and Mexico where women can own property, she was able to have land of her own, some of it given to her by her father. And that all sounds good, but there's a thing called land rich, cash poor. If you have property, but you can't develop it, to pay for the taxes, for example, as well as the maintenance and other things you have to do with your property, then you could still have a financial drain on you. But she did have land, and she was able to give some of that to some of her children, hoping, I assume, that they'd be able to make their way in this post-bank financial situation. There were several ranches the family had owned before the bank failure, and as I said, most of that was lost to Baldwin. He did sell 50 acres and the Temple family's home to them in 1881. Actually, I say home, it's actually two houses. So there is an adobe house that was built in the early 1850s. Here on the left, you can see actually there's a couple members of the family standing in front of the adobe. And then the bottom right, you can see part of the adobe structure in the background here. There was a brick building built in the 1870s as the family had many more children and all that. So there were actually two houses. This is in the Whittier Narrows, just below Whittier Narrows Regional Park, maybe a mile south of the 60 freeway. Whittier Narrows Dam is right there. It's actually a floodplain and subject, of course, to inundation from the San Gabriel River. But that's where the family property was located. And Baldwin did sell 50 acres, the homes and outbuildings, to Mrs. Temple in her name. Meanwhile, over here where the museum is today, there was a similar situation. Francis W. Temple, who was a grandson of William Workman and the son of FPF Temple and Antonia Margarita Temple, was able to remain on the property and was farming, mainly had a vineyard, as you can see in this map here along the San Jose Creek, and was able to make enough wine and money between 1876 and 1879, when Baldwin foreclosed, that he had the cash to be able to buy 75 acres. The Workman house is here in the center of the map, the family cemetery and chapel over to the east. There are barns and stables, 3 wine cellars, a smokehouse, all within close proximity to the building. And he purchased the 75 acres in the fall of 1880 from Baldwin for about $5,000. So the two families were able to keep very small parts of what had once been thousands and thousands of acres of land on their ranch, or respective ranches. The Workman home shown here in the 1870s was lived in by Francis for about 8 years. He did pretty well in terms of managing the vineyards and making a living during that time period. Not quite the same situation for his mother over at the Temple Homestead, a few miles to the west. Let me just go through some of the stories of the children of the family here as well, because a lot of variation in their stories I think is quite interesting. The oldest, Thomas, was really groomed to be his father's business successor. So for example, he was a clerk in the Temple and Workman Bank. He was a trustee of the Los Angeles Public Library. He was involved in clubs. He was called Lord Chesterfield because he had very polite manners, handsome, well-dressed, had a nice home in Los Angeles. Unfortunately, when the bank collapsed, it was learned that he was in debt to the bank to the tune of tens of thousands of dollars in loans, which is a bit of a problem with vested interest in things. So Thomas wound up not having much to live on, except that his mother did give him some property near the Temple Homestead out in what is now South El Monte. So he moved out there. This is the 1880 census taken in June, end of June of that year. Thomas and his wife living out there, and he's working as a farmer, but he really wasn't cut out to be a farmer. He did not stay long doing that. In fact, within maybe a year or two, he and his wife moved. They were in Arizona for a period of time. They had a son who died as a small child. And then the couple wound up in Hermosillo in the northern state of Sonora in Mexico. And he was there for several years. He was involved in real estate. He apparently owned a tavern or a saloon. A lot of mining activity in that part of Mexico. So there were some indications he may have been involved in some of that. Occasionally, you can find sources of some of the stuff that people would be involved in by looking, of course, at newspapers. So on the top right here is a short article from 1883 saying that he was formerly of Los Angeles, but living at Hermosillo, visiting Tucson, a lot of connections between southern Arizona, New Mexico, Texas, of course, and then northern Mexico. He did get involved in a couple of companies. One was started in San Francisco in the mid-1880s called the Mexican Development Company, and it shows him as being the Secretary on Foreign Relations. So this is probably where you see most of the names are Anglos, and I'm assuming that almost none of them would have any knowledge of the Spanish language except for Temple and the attorney on foreign relations, Jose Godoy. But presumably Thomas was there to facilitate relationships between the people in San Francisco and those in the parts of Mexico they were working on. This article does say he was specifically involved with the business that was there to work on introducing electricity into Mexico. I don't know how far this company got in its work, but a lot of Americans and Europeans were pouring into Mexico during these years when Porfirio Diaz, the dictator of Mexico, was encouraging foreign investment for things like railroads, later on oil development, as well as things like electricity. 1887, the California and Mexican Land Company was formed, a local Los Angeles business. Reginaldo del Valle, whose family owned a large property on the fringes of Los Angeles County and Ventura County, west of Six Flags and Santa Clarita, politician, very involved. Gentlemen, del Valle and Temple were friends from quite a long way back. Again, not a lot of indication of how well this did, but if you notice, it says on the article, it proposes to buy lands and form colonies. This was a big thing in the 19th century, was trying to get colonies of people, not necessarily Spanish speakers, but probably mostly, who would go from California and other parts of the Southwest and settle in northern Mexico. How well this did is hard to say, but it does show that Thomas was trying to keep his hand in business activities during this time period. By the end of the 80s, he wound up back in Los Angeles and was the proprietor editor with a partner first and then on his own of La Crónica, which was a long-standing Spanish language newspaper. So the point is that members of the Temple family did have facility and background, and not just in what was happening in the Anglo world in Los Angeles, but also in the Latino world. So Thomas is an example of that in spending quite a number of years in Mexico during the 1880s period. Second eldest of the Temple children was Francis. I referred to him before. He was a winemaker for his grandfather, William Workman, at the Workman Homestead. When the bank collapsed and then Workman committed suicide, it was Francis who had to send news to his family about what had happened. As I mentioned before, he stayed on, occupied the Workman house for the next several years and was able to buy the 75-acre homestead. He did have lung problems, consumption or tuberculosis, as it is known, and so that shortened his life considerably. In the 1880 census, he is listed as a farmer, again, mostly winemaking, but he did have orchards and some field crops that he was raising on the property as well. He did have a foreman, a guy named Joseph Drown, who was living in the property with them. And interesting, the next family groups below them are all Indians. There weren't a lot of native peoples left, but it does look like there were 7 or 8 of them who were living and working on the homestead. It's possible they were for maybe the households below that, but anyway, Francis is proprietor here at the homestead. Third child was William, who had been educated in the law, went to Harvard Law School and got his degree there in the mid-1870s, studied for a year in England at the Inns of Court in London, was in the middle of his studies over there in the United Kingdom when he was called back very suddenly to try to help sort out the mess with the family bank. He was in his mid-20s. He hadn't really been practicing law yet, still studying, and suddenly was drawn into this maelstrom with the bank, with the financial situations of his father and grandfather. And after several years, it got to him. He clearly was overwhelmed with the amount of work he had to do, understandably. And so what he did as this 1880s decade started, on the right here is the register of enlistments for the United States Army up in San Francisco. And William joined on July 16th, a artillery regiment, and was in the Presidio getting his initial basic training, and then served 4 years in the Army, was discharged as a sergeant in Rhode Island in 1884. But the enlistment shows that he was 29 years old in 1880, he was a lawyer, etc. And he even wrote letters subsequently, basically telling his family members and others that he had joined the Army for a very specific reason. The letter on the left here is actually written from the Presidio, November 12th, 1880, to Lucky Baldwin. And at the top, he asked somebody in his family to save this copy. People would do that. They would write their letter out and then actually handwrite a copy and preserve it in a file. And in this letter, he is telling Baldwin that he had been visited by somebody who was an estate administrator for his father, and that he had joined the army for a reason. He didn't want to deal with this administrator, but he did ask Baldwin to be honorable and to keep his word to sell property and help William's mother and his siblings have a place to live. At the end of the decade, he is in Mexico City. He had been in Albuquerque, New Mexico for some time after he had left the army, and then wound up in Mexico City, writing one of his brothers, presumably Walter, who wound up owning the homestead later, and telling him, among other things, that he was enjoying Mexico, that he liked the people, and that he had met with a former Los Angeles attorney and judge, Ignacio Sepulveda, a very prominent figure in Los Angeles before he went to Mexico in the 1880s and remained there for 30 years. And William told his brother that he was going to actually join forces with Sepulveda in business, the law, land issues, and mining. We don't know if that actually took place, but it looks like William spent much of about 20 years in Mexico between the late 1880s and about 1910, around the time, by the way, that Porfirio Diaz was overthrown during one of the many revolutions in Mexico. Fifth child was John, and John was about 20 when the bank collapsed. He had been studying back in Massachusetts, where his father was from, had gone to high school in his father's hometown of Reading, north and west of Boston, then went to commercial school there in Boston, got his diploma, and in 1876 he had to come back home. He was given some land by his mother, very close to where the Temple Homestead is. So if any of you know the Whittier Narrows Nature Center off of Durfee Avenue, just below the 60 on the west bank of the San Gabriel River and across from South Amani High School, that was John Temple's 130-acre homestead in the 1870s and 1880s. So the 1880 census shows him living on that property, raising walnuts and other crops. This map actually does show the homestead. So this is the San Gabriel River snaking through the area. The 60 freeway would come right about where the top of the image is, Durfee Avenue, heading down towards the Whittier Narrows Dam. And Whittier Narrows Park is right where I'm highlighting here towards the top. So he was there for quite a while. In 1886, he married a young woman named Anita de Vust, whose mother was a Dominguez from the prominent family of the San Pedro South Bay area. And they wound up having a large family. But John, for most of the 1880s, lived very close to his mother and siblings, who were just outside of this image off here to the left, just very close to where he was living. Now, Mrs. Temple had her minor children, meaning those who were below a certain age. In 1880, there were 3 younger children of the 8 who survived. There were originally 11 kids. And so Mrs. Temple is living with a 14-year-old daughter, Margarita, her 12-year-old son, Walter, later owner of the homestead, and Charles, who was 9. There is a 4th child listed here, Andrea, age 8. We have no other knowledge of that. The family never talked about it in any of their very significant and detailed writings. She may have been adopted. Maybe it was a local child in that area, but this is the only information we have about her. By the way, in the 1880 census, Mrs. Workman was also living with her daughter. So whether she was going back and forth between the Workman house and living with her daughter is a little bit unclear, and 2 Indian servants in the household also. But again, Mrs. Temple is grappling with having 50 acres, not a lot of money, and trying to figure out how she's going to raise her children and do this on her own. Interestingly, just a few months after this, she wound up marrying a man who was about half her age. It did not last long. The marriage was actually annulled within a few months. I imagine there was probably a lot of conflict within the family about that. And her son, William, in that letter to Baldwin, actually talked about his mother's conduct. He didn't go into any detail about it, but it was right around the time that she was marrying this much younger man. So maybe she was desperate to try to find a way to deal with the situation that she was handed after her husband died earlier in 1880. This census was taken just a couple months after her husband's death. among these many other conflicts going on, I made some reference to this before, was the question of the guardianship of her younger children. And Mrs. Temple did not become the guardian. It wound up going to a couple of her sons at different periods of time. And there was also an estate administrator for her husband's estate who was a family friend. That did not go well either. And so I'm not going to go into any detail about it because it's a long, very complicated story. But this article on the left is from 1881. This one on the right is from 1885. The legal battles actually went on through almost the entirety of the decade. And so whether it was fighting over who's going to be guardian of the kids and protect their interests, or in this case on the right, it's a foreclosure sale for her property, that 50-acre homestead that Baldwin had sold to her. It says that she was indebted to about $4,000. Now it turned out that her children, her older sons, were able to get enough money together to pay that debt off, and she was able to avoid foreclosure. But these are indications of just how difficult the family circumstances were during this time period. Of these younger children, there were two daughters. Lucinda was the oldest. In 1880, she was married. She married a young man named Manuel Arnas. And the Arnas family was from Ventura. Actually, the patriarch was Spanish, born in Spain. Very prominent, very wealthy family. Unfortunately, Manuel was an alcoholic. And so their marriage did not last long. She filed for divorce once and then retracted it. Obviously tried to make it work. And then in the 1880s, towards the end of the decade, a divorce was granted because they could not track down Arnas, and basically he had abandoned her. And so she wound up resuming her maiden name. She did marry subsequently to a gentleman also named Manuel Zuniga, who was raised in the same area as the Temples in the Whittier Narrows location. But that's more of an 1890s story that I'll save for next time. It just shows you that large families, of course, can have very different degrees of ups and downs in their lives. Daughter number 2 was Margarita Temple. She was about 6 years younger than her sister. At the end of the 1880s, she married Samuel Rowland, the only example of an intermarriage between the Temples and the Rowland family of Rancho La Puente. And they wound up living in the area beyond that. We'll talk about Samuel Rowland in a subsequent talk when he was dealing with real estate very close to the homestead in the 1910s. Finally, there were 2 younger boys. So of the 8 surviving children, we're now down to the last 2. Walter on the left. Don't have an early photo of Charles as a young man, but that's him in the 1890s on the right. They were about 3 years apart. And so they were among the 3 children who had the guardianship issues going on. Walter and Charles were sent to schools during the 1880s. Their older siblings had largely finished their educations during that time. St. Vincent's College, which later went on to become Loyola Marymount University, was a Catholic school that really, it was called a college, but it educated basically from about, I'd say, 4th grade up through the college level in several different locations. When they were there, the school had been moving. So this photo shows them very close to Pershing Square in the southwest part of downtown Los Angeles. The campus then moved down to Washington Boulevard, just south of what is now the 10 freeway. Catholic school, of course, and they went there basically through high school, both of them, during most of the 1880s. So I'm assuming that they probably boarded at the school for much of that time.
Paul?
Yes.
Quick question. Alan asked, it stated that the money was owed in gold coin, but it was against her property. Could you clarify that?
Well, payment was usually referred to in gold coin. There was in the 19th century, 1800s, there was still that designation. Going from gold to paper was still a big deal for a lot of people during that period of time. So it's basically just telling you the amount of money that she would owe if she was going to be able to pay off her debt on this. And as I said, my understanding is that the family actually was able to pool money together and pay Theodore Lamp, what he was owed so that she could maintain her 50-acre homestead. Okay, so as I said, Francis Temple, owner of the Workman Homestead for most of the 80s, had tuberculosis. He spent a lot of his time in his later years in Arizona, where it was hotter and drier, trying to clear out his lungs. But his condition continued to worsen. Incidentally, while he was gone much of the time, he had a young woman who was raised in the old Mission or Whittier Narrows area where the Temples had long lived. Her name was Laura Gonzalez, and she was basically his right-hand woman, if you want to put it that way. She basically ran the ranch for extended periods while Francis was in Arizona. But he did succumb to his illness in August 1888, just a few days before his 40th birthday. He died in the same room in which he was born, in the Workman house. And then it was time to dispose of his property. Unfortunately, this happens more frequently than we realize sometimes. His older brother, Thomas, filed a protest to the will because evidently it didn't have much form in it. In fact, I've seen what the disposition of the property was, and I think Thomas was given a small amount of money or a watch or something like that. But just another indication of how in troubled times, family members can wind up having conflicts because there's not a lot of money, and whatever there is, people are maybe going to fight over that. But what wound up happening when Francis died is that he left the 75-acre Workman homestead to two brothers, William and John. Now, William, as I mentioned, had been in the Army for several years in the early 80s and then was out of state. And so he wound up selling his interest in the homestead to John for $3,000. So John, pictured here with his wife, Anita DeBoost, and their two oldest sons, and her father standing in front of the Workman house, maybe at the very end of the 1880s, potentially early 1890s. And since we're here, I just want to point out way over here in the corner, you can see a little bit of the water tower that we still have at the homestead. So if you're visiting us next time, you can look at the water tower that's just south of the Workman house and look back to this picture. And over here is a little bit of the roof line of the winery where our current homestead gallery and offices are located. I'm going to jump back to this letter that William wrote in 1889 because it does talk quite a bit about what he wanted to do with the homestead. It is January 14th, and so it's about maybe 6 months after Francis had died, 5 months, and he's writing to this brother, Walter is the best guess, that he has a plan to take care of the old folks, which I take to mean his mother and his grandmother. And the plan is that he'll sell his interest to John for $3,000. John will contribute $2,000 of his own money, and that's what the mother and grandmother will live off of. William even calculated $50 a month should last them about 6 years. And so that's why he wanted to sell his interest. He says in this letter that he was never going to go back to Los Angeles. Whether it was the bitterness of having to deal with the family financial situation or not is not stated. But William did come back many years later. But that's what wound up happening with the homestead, is that he sold his interest to John, who then occupied the property. So we'll talk more about John Temple and his ownership of the homestead in the 1890s, because most of his years owning the property was during that subsequent decade.
Paul?
Yes.
We had a question about the St. Vincent property. Is that the block surrounded by Broadway 6th, 7th and Hill?
That sounds right. It was on the south side of, I'm trying to think now, south side of 6th, I guess, would be, yeah. Yep. So kind of cater corner, I understand it, to Pershing Square, but in that area. I've got a photo coming up, in fact, that'll show it. So
Thank you.
We can do that then, of course. Now, we talked a lot about the temples, and William Workman and Nicolaso Urioste, the original owners of the Workman Homestead and half of the Rancho La Puente, did have a son, and his name was Joseph. He was sent back to the East Coast as a young boy to get an education, which is his sister, by the way, could not read or write. That was not uncommon back then. Usually the boys were favored when it came to education. And Joseph was probably gone from, I would guess, maybe the age of 9 or 10 until he was about 21. And he returned to California with his father's brother, David Workman, and his family in the mid-1850s. But he did not come back to this area right away. What his father did is he sent him to the Central Valley, where William Workman and his son-in-law, FPF Temple, had extensive cattle interest and land and all that. And so Joseph spent about 15 years living in the lower part of the San Joaquin Valley, where the Grapevine is located today, At different times, he was probably closer to Fresno and the gold country. And that's where he met a young woman named Josephine Belt, who was a resident of Stockton. Her father was American, her mother was from Chile. And so Joseph Workman married Josephine Belt in 1870 and then came back to this area. And this map shows the roughly 800 acres that William Workman gave to his son, although he subsequently told his son that this 800 acres was not for him, it was for his children. In other words, for Workman's grandchildren, an indication that father and son did not appear to get along all that well. In fact, Joseph had to send friends out to the Workman house. So just to give you an idea where this is a large creek, Dalton, or Walnut Creek, I think it's called. It's south of the 10 and empties into the San Gabriel River where the 605 is. So the Bassett community is located in this area. And the Workman house is about a few miles to the south, a little bit to the east. Joseph actually sent friends a couple of times to induce his father to actually give him the physical deed. And William finally did it by throwing it on the floor in the Workman house and telling the friend, who was William Rowland, sheriff of Los Angeles County, pick it up off the floor basically. And then Joseph ran in and got his deed recorded. Well, in the 1880s, Joseph was raising sheep and farming out there and decided he didn't want to do that anymore. So he leased out his 800 acres and he moved into Los Angeles. This is the 1880 census where he's still at Rancho La Puente. It says he's a stock raiser and farmer, his wife, Josephine, and their 6 children, or pardon me, 5 children. They wound up having 7, 6 of whom lived to be adults. But Joseph, within a year of this, decided to move into Boyle Heights, which was a community started by his cousin, William H. Workman. So this is the Joseph Workman house on Boyle Avenue, right next door to his cousin's home. Beautiful structure. And that's where he lived in the 1880s and into the 1890s. And he leased out his ranch at La Puente. And judging by the house and some of the newspaper articles that can be found, they appeared to have lived a pretty nice life while they could afford to do so. When we get into the 1890s part of the story, next time around, we'll see a very dramatic change to their fortunes. But during the 80s, they were doing quite well for themselves. Now, that cousin I mentioned of Joseph's, who was the founder of Boyle Heights, and we probably should have a family tree to point some of this out. But in any case, William Workman of the Homestead, I mentioned, had a brother, David, who brought his family out in the 1850s. And that branch of the family wound up living in Los Angeles for many years. 2 of the members of that family were brothers, William here on the left, on the right, and Elijah here on the left. They were saddle makers, very involved in local politics, Board of Education, city council members, and etc. And so as the Workmans and Temples, who were involved in the bank and lived out in the San Gabriel Valley, were having a descent in their fortunes in the 1880s. These 2 were rising in Los Angeles economically and politically. Elijah was a saddler for many years, and so he and his brother had been partners for on and off for probably close to 20. And when William, his brother, decided he didn't want to be a saddler anymore, had some other things he wanted to do, Elijah stayed on and ran the business out of the same building that they had been in for a number of years. He later had a partner, Manuel Montijo, in Los Angeles. And then Elijah himself retired from the business to dedicate himself to farming and ranching. In the 1880 census, he is shown on his Main Street property with his wife and family, including a Chinese house servant and a worker from Missouri. The property he was occupying is this one, which was, as you can see, out in the suburbs, if you want to call it that. So the city of Los Angeles, this is the early 1870s, was quite a distance away. To give you an idea of where we're located, this is Main Street. Off to the left here, forking off to the left is Spring Street. 10th runs along this fence, and this is 11th Street. This is a kind of a gritty industrial area just above the 10 freeway today. But in the 1870s, it was farmland. And Elijah was quite an experimentalist to tobacco and rare fruit trees and all kinds of other things. So after he decided he didn't want to do the saddlery and harness thing anymore, he's pushing 50 by that point, he spent more of his time working on his farm. But as the city was starting to grow, in the 1880s, especially when the boom of the 80s came towards the latter part of that decade, he was getting offers that were just too irresistible. And he wound up selling this property and moving to Boyle Heights, very close to his brother, the founder of that community. And Elijah remained in Boyle Heights until he died in the early 1900s. But a great photo that shows you LA from a view that is not too common to see. Now, his younger brother, William Henry, the reason why he got out of the saddlery business is because he had married a young woman named Mariah Boyle, whose father, Andrew, owned an extensive property east of the Los Angeles River. And when Boyle died in 1871, he left his estate to his daughter and therefore his son-in-law. And William H. Workman, as this 1880 census listing shows, was an orchardist. He was devoting more of his time to vineyards and to fruit crops and that sort of thing. Very extensive property along the Los Angeles River, what's called the flats of Boyle Heights today. That's where the vineyards primarily were. And then up on the bluff, the area was called Parlon Blanco, or White Bluff, for a reason. On the bluffs, then other parts of the estate were farmed for field crops and fruit orchards and that sort of thing. And so that's what William Henry decided to do as time went on, got out of the harness business and saddlery business and got more into the farming side of things. On this property, which is on Boyle Avenue in 1880, he's got an extensive number of servants, Latinos, as well as Anglos. He's got a Chinese cook in the household, which is not too uncommon, but pretty extensive property. We have a very cleaned up drawing in an 1880 book of the Workman estate, formerly the Boyle estate, before that owned by the Lopez family, a prominent California family. But here you can see the white bluff that gave the area its name, Parlon Blanco, Boyle Avenue running along the side here. And then the Workman property, at that time, it was actually the old Boyle house that they were living in exclusively. The flats is the area to the left here. So the LA River would be off to the upper left side of the image here. And so a lot of the vineyards and orchards were planted to get irrigated from the river down below, but there was some of that up at the top of the bluffs too. And they actually introduced a water system to deliver that to the top area there. It's again, a kind of a cleaned up view. In 1880, there were other people living in this area. Boyle Heights did have a small community by that point. It was founded in 1875. In fact, I think what you can see is that water delivery system here looks like a piping system to bring water into the estate there. William Henry did wind up building a house in front of the old Boyle house, so or next to it, that is. And so this is the home that he built in the 1880s on that property that I just showed you the map here. So he had two different homes there at different times. Now, while William was a founder of Boyle Heights, along with banker Isaiah W. Hellman, former banking partner of FPF Temple and William Workman, and current banker at Farmers and Merchants, as well as a guy named John Lazarovich, who was married into the Lopez family. Boyle Heights was founded in 1875, just before the economic downturn that lasted for almost a decade. So the community didn't grow that dramatically in the late 1870s and into the early 1880s. So they certainly tried. Workman advertising some of his property here on this advertisement to the left in the early 1880s, an article from I think about 1884 where it talks about Boyle Heights being the Brooklyn of Los Angeles. So if you think of Brooklyn, New York being across the East River and having a connection to New York City that way. Brooklyn was an independent city until 1890, by the way. Boyle Heights, similarly, it was across the Los Angeles River from Los Angeles to the east, and so they're trying to make this link between the two. But of course, Brooklyn was far bigger than Boyle Heights in those days. But they were certainly trying, and eventually, when there was a new boom, railroads came in directly to Los Angeles, and people were pouring in by the thousands at the end of the 1880s. Boyle Heights finally did take off and become a much more successful subdivision. So a couple of examples of that would be some of the new buildings being built. This is the Cummings block at Boyle and First, still standing, recently remodeled, and being rented actually to musicians and other people, low-income people, through a city program. So the structure still stands, doesn't have the tower anymore, but still there. And then bringing in transportation. So having the cable railway as an indication of how much technologically things had changed. The sign is kind of cool because on the left, it says in 1879, they had horses drawing streetcars, and horses are running wild, and the cars stopped, and people were trying to track the horses down. It probably wasn't that bad, but they were just showing you how primitive things were technologically. But now in 1889, you've got the smooth running cable railway system coming up to Boyle Heights. In fact, you can see the Cummings block with its tower back in the background there. So this is First Street heading towards Boyle Avenue. That boom of the 80s, as I said, was pretty much confined to a couple of years, 1887 and 1888. This is about that time. Spring Street, you can see a ton of activity, lots of vehicles and pedestrians. Electricity had come in the early 80s, so there's all kinds of power lines and telegraph wires, and eventually you'd have electric wires for the streetcars that would be coming within a couple of years. So things were really taken off during those couple of years. Another view of Spring Street from probably a little bit further to the south, I'm guessing. But again, lots going on. And it just so happened that as the boom of the 80s is occurring in 87 and 88, the mayor of Los Angeles is William H. Workman, who ran for election at the end of 1886. And so you can see an article here on the left saying, cast your vote for this old timer who was only 47, but he'd been in the town for about 30 plus years. Industrious, progressive, et cetera, et cetera. Interestingly, he was a Democrat at a time when the Republican Party completely dominated Los Angeles politics. When he got here as a young man in the 50s, it was the other way around. Republicans hardly existed, and the Democrats ruled the roost. But by the time he became mayor, he was the only Democrat to hold city office during that time. Even in the early 1900s, when he became city treasurer, he was the only Democrat. But he was a moderate conservative Democrat, and personally very popular. So that appears to have helped him win office. There were some issues, though, with this campaign that's worth bringing up, having to do with race. For example, there were some attacks on him because supposedly he would not hire white men and would only hire Chinese. So just before the election, here on the far left, Workman felt compelled to write a letter to the Los Angeles Herald addressing an editorial from another paper called the Tribune, which no longer exists, where it was alleged by the Tribune that Workman is the steadfast friend of the Chinese and has paid them thousands of dollars to the detriment of white laboring men who would have been glad to do work for him. The anti-Chinese sentiment, as some of you I'm sure know, was very, very strong in the West Coast, as well as in Los Angeles back then. And so any accusations about hiring Chinese was a big deal, generally speaking, much less politics. And not only did Workman try to address that by saying, I only hired Chinese if I had to, because white men could not or would not do the work that I would do, but he had his foreman, the same Joseph W. Drown I mentioned before. Joseph Drown was actually working for Francis Temple at the Workman Homestead in the early 80s, and then went over to work for William H. Workman at Boyle Heights. And Drown goes into some detail saying, I've been a foreman for 5 years. Mr. Workman's told me to hire only white men if I could, and I've only hired the Chinese. It was necessary to do so. If I hadn't, his crops would have died. Kind of an extraordinary situation that we're seeing here. But it wasn't limited to just the Chinese. There was also a statement made by an unnamed newspaper and addressed by, again, the Herald, about the alleged fact that all the colored men in this city voted for Workman as mayor. And it was talked about as being treasonable to the party. He is a Democrat, and it was pointed out that Workman was of Southern birth. He was born in Missouri, which was actually a border state. It had many Southern sympathizers, but it also had many Union supporters during the Civil War. The article here says that the colored voters knew or know that Workman is from Missouri, but that's why they voted for him. He's far from being the first or only man of that section for whom Black voters supported. So it's just intriguing to see how this is being looked at from a racial perspective when it comes to these elections back in the 1880s period. Now, Workman had a lot to do during his time as mayor. In fact, mayors for quite a number of years were also judges. They had a police court or a mayor's court, and these were usually the lowest level offenders. We're talking basically about street fights and public drunkenness. And it was one thing when the population of the town was very small and there weren't that many people to have to deal with in the mayor's court. But by the time the boom of the 80s happened, it was clear that there was no way the mayor could devote the time necessary to do that. So within a few months of his taking office, they made changes to the legal system so the mayor didn't have to preside over a court any longer. But there were things like what to do with improving the streets and highways. They were still dirt streets. They would sprinkle them with water to try and keep the dust down. But under Workman's administration, and I'm sure they've been planning this before, but under his term, they began to pave the streets. Now, paving is not like we do today. It was a different way of doing things to try to get the streets to be a little more smooth and uniform and all of that. Improving schools. With the number of people coming in, it was pretty hard to keep up with the population growth in building schools. A new city hall was constructed during this time. A Los Angeles charter was introduced or reformed of the charter. So lots of activities going on, and a kind of a great source for this would be the annual messages that the mayors would give, whether it's the incoming mayor's initial message at the end of December when they took office, or at the end of the year during their 2-year term. So these are just samples of some of the year-end addresses that Workman gave to the council, which are read during the council meetings, and lots of great information. So the one on the far right, for example, is at the end of his term and talking about how many arrests were made, what the amount of fines were that were collected, and et cetera. So definitely interesting to see what was going on in city politics and how the mayor would look at things during these 2-year terms that they had. So he is presiding over things during that boom, and just as he's leaving office, the boom is about to go bust. And so the economy starts to tail off, the number of people coming in starts to decline, and things are going to get a little tough for Los Angeles at the very end of the 80s and into the early 1890s. And we'll talk about that in the next presentation. But here are a few views of this period of time. Again, looking at the 1880s. So probably from the high school, looking out towards northeast Los Angeles. This large building is the Baker Block. So the 101 goes right through that building today. So you're looking off, close to the plaza would be off here to the left. Out in the distance would be Lincoln Heights, those kinds of areas. This photo on the right is Broadway, which was still called Fort Street until about 1890 because of Fort Moore, which was an American military installation from the Mexican-American War. You're looking south on Fort. And the new city hall that was constructed under Workman's administration is here on the left, between 1st and 2nd, I believe, on Broadway. A couple other neat photographs. This one on the bottom right is an area that was known as different things, but Belmont was one name given for it. So west of town, west of what is now the 110, and a new area that was opening up in the 1880s, about the time that Workman was mayor. This is a photo I was referring to before where you can see St. Vincent's College as it existed. So this looks to me like Pershing Square. So Biltmore Hotel would be in the foreground about where this church is located, maybe off to the left a little bit. And the photo is actually taken from the normal school, which was the state school for teacher education. Now the Los Angeles Central Public Library, looking off to the east. So to answer that person's question, yeah, this is St. Vincent's. So again, what's 6th, I guess, and around Broadway and Hill, like the person was saying. Okay, well, I hope you had a decent idea of how the family's fortunes went one way or another, rising or falling during the 1880s. And we will pick up the story next time. We don't have a date yet, so it could be as early as late spring, maybe into the summer. And we'll talk about the Workman and Temple families during the 1890s, known as the gay 90s, and the end of the Gilded Age at the end of the 19th century.